Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Unscripted History, where today I'll be presenting you with the second part of the history of the Kingdom of Sardinia, which will be stretching from 1713 all the way to 1849. So 1713 we see as the Treaty of Utrecht ultimately ends the War of Spanish Succession, where we see as House Savoy ultimately ends up acquiring the Kingdom of Sicily, and the Habsburgs end up acquiring the Kingdom of Sardinia. But then we see as the War of the Quadruple Alliance occurs, which is ultimately ended with the Treaty of Hague, or Hague, however you want to say it, at the end on February 17th, 1720, where here we see as Victor Amadeus, the member of House Savoy, the head of House Savoy at the time, is actually forced to exchange the Kingdom of Sicily for the Kingdom of Sardinia, with the Habsburgs then acquiring Sicily, and obviously Amadeus ultimately acquiring the Kingdom of Sardinia. So then after this, we see as nothing much happens. We do see as Amadeus is kind of begrudgingly accepting the title of King of Sardinia, because he doesn't actually officially fully accept it until 1723, and here he recognizes himself as the King of Sardinia, Jerusalem, and Cyprus, though they did not have control over it at the time, because it was actually the Ottomans who controlled these areas. But then we see ultimately as we end up passing to what happened with the capitals, because the capital actually did change during this reign. This was one of the more significant portions of the Savoyan reign over Sardinia. So from 1324 to 1720, the capital of the Kingdom of Sardinia had actually been Cagliari, which is reasonable because it is on the Isle of Sardinia. However, during the reign of Victor Amadeus II, we see as he actually swaps the capital to a continental capital, where we see as the capital is now Turin, which is in the area of Piedmont, region of Piedmont. And so this would last until 1798, where a Jurassic change happens. So after this, the next big event that happens is the 1767 to 1769 acquisition of the Maddalena Archipelago, which was acquired by Charles Emmanuel III from the Republic of Genoa, because obviously Sardinia and Genoa is going to keep their beef up throughout all of this. But yeah. So then after that, the next big event that we see happen is in 1792, when the Kingdom of Sardinia ultimately ends up joining the first coalition against the First French Republic. And we see here that ultimately Napoleon does end up, in fact, defeating the Kingdom of Sardinia, or at least forcing them into an unfavorable treaty with the Treaty of Paris in 1796, which allows French troops to pass through the area of Piedmont, which is the continental region of the Kingdom of Sardinia. So after this, we see as there's quite a bit of tension between the two, and ultimately on December 6, 1798, we see as, I'm going to butcher this name, Bartholomew Jalbert ultimately ends up taking the capital of Turin and forcing King at the time Charles Emmanuel IV to Sardinia in exile, though technically that's closer to his actual kingdom, but I don't know, who cares. So we actually see then as the French hold the area for at least almost not even a full year, because we see in 1799 that Austro-Russian forces ultimately end up taking it back for a brief time, but then in 1800, after the Battle of Moringa, we see that the French forces once again recapture Turin and Piedmont. So then after this, we see in 1814, ultimately the Sardinians reclaim their territory here with the 1814 Congress of Vienna, and we also see as they end up acquiring the lands of the entire Republic of Genoa, which expands their lands quite a bit. And this is obviously because they were just acquiring more land with their assistance during the war. And so then on 1817, we get another land acquisition with the Treaty of, I believe it was Stupinigi, where they end up acquiring the land of modern-day Monaco. So they have expanded their borders quite a bit throughout all this warring and everything. But yeah, so this ultimately ends up continuing on. Also, I forgot to mention, after their defeat at the in December 6th, 1798, Charles Emmanuel IV actually ended up abdicating the throne to Victor Emmanuel I, which, if you know anything about Italian history, he is related to Victor Emmanuel II, who is a very important figure in Italian history. So, with this, we end up seeing, like I said, it progresses on after the war. In we don't get to see too much action. There is some minor events that happened in 1821. And during this time, like I said, it's relatively peaceful. We see as in 1830, the Kingdom of Sardinia begins to industrialize, and this kind of just continues to progress. So ultimately, we see as, like I said, Victor Emmanuel I ends up reigning for quite a while, And then he is succeeded by Charles Felix, and then ultimately Charles Albert. Now, Charles Albert is the father of Victor Emmanuel II, and he is the one who does a lot for the Kingdom of Sardinia. So we see in 1847, he ultimately ends up establishing what will become known as the Great Fusion, which ultimately leads to the fall of, I guess, singular Kingdom of Sardinian or Sardinian autonomy, ultimately end up combining it with the area of Piedmont and Turin and all of that. Also, I forgot to mention, after 1814, the capital returned to Cagliari, so yeah, no more Turin capital. But yeah, so after that, wait, hold on, yeah, because it was in Cagliari. No, okay, yeah, okay, sorry. 1798 to 1814, it was back in Cagliari because Charles Emmanuel IV and Charles Emmanuel IV and Victor Emmanuel I were down in Sardinia. And then, after 1814, they ended up swapping back to Turin until ultimately in 1848, where it would be established as the significant, no, not the significant, but the main capital, the actual de facto capital. But yeah, so after that, 1847, like I said, they ultimately end up committing the Great Fusion, which ultimately combines the region of Piedmont with Sardinia and all of its other lands, so they become one autonomous unit rather than multiple separate semi-autonomous units. And so, after that, we see then in 1848 as the, I believe, what was the exact name? It was the Statuto Albertini, which I presume is named after Charles Albert, but it becomes the constitution of the Kingdom of Sardinia. So with this, we see as Roman Catholicism becomes the main church, and we see also as the power within the land is returned to the central monarchy and the church. And so with this, we see now as the Kingdom of Sardinia has established itself pretty well with this constitution and all that, so it decides to strike out. So what it decides to strike out at is Austria and the Habsburgs. And they start off with this war, and they do pretty well for themselves. But ultimately, they end up suffering a massive defeat in 1848 at the Battle of, I believe it was Custoza. And at this battle, they, like I said, they ultimately end up getting defeating, and Charles Albert is relatively humiliated from this. So we see after this as politically, the Kingdom of Sardinia starts to decline a little bit, and this ultimately leads to the abdication of Charles Albert on March 23rd, 1849, to his son, Victor Emmanuel II. Now, after this, we see, in fact, that Italian history and Sardinian history will experience a era of relative prosperity, ultimately gaining their complete unification of Italy in, I believe, 1870. But yeah, so I decided to end in 1849 because after the rise of Victor Emmanuel II to power, it becomes more Italian history rather than Sardinian history, because I wanted to really focus on Sardinia. And so yeah, that's kind of the complete history, well, not complete, but I guess medieval to early modern history of the Kingdom of Sardinia. And yeah, I just really enjoyed researching this. It was super fun, and I loved learning about an area of history that I had not learned about prior. And I loved learning about all of these random monarchs that I had no clue about prior to this, and learning about wars that I had no idea about. So yeah, just super fun thing to learn about. I highly recommend researching the Isle of Sardinia yourself if you're ever bored one day, because that's what I did personally. But yeah, like I said, that's all there really is for that history, and that's all I really have for this episode of Unscripted History. So thank you very much for watching.